35 minutes, so there will be opportunities for questions or comments. But the way I would like to structure this is the presentation is structured in 5 different sections, if you will. So maybe at the end of each section, we can have a brief discussion, a larger one at the end. Feel free to interrupt in the middle. This is really a story of what we did in our department for philosophy during not the current, but the previous assessment cycle. So these are the 5 sections of the presentation, and there are some, I don't know if you can see the pointer here, but the strategies are ideas that we had that we, generally speaking, gathered from relevant literature and then tried to implement in our department. And the challenges here are things that are, in some sense, endemic to assessment, especially when it comes to data collection. But these are things that we should try to overcome in the future, really. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this presentation, our closing the loop activities were sponsored with a grant from Triton College. All right, so strategy number 1, alignment is key. I'll walk through this in the sense of through a metaphor to begin, right? So often in higher ed or in education in general, we talk about mapping and alignment as 2 sides of the same coin. But often we also don't think this metaphor through enough, and that's what I would like to do for a few minutes. So here's a map of a place you're very familiar with. But I also think that when we look at maps philosophically, we need to remember 2 things. Number 1, maps are representations. They are not actual places. And that will bear later on the differences between what we do with our students and the data that we collect. Number 2, maps are do not have an orientation. What do I mean by this? They tell us where is north and where is south, etc., but they don't tell us where to go. They just tell us that from a bird's eye view, this is the landscape that we have. I think that when we think about mapping in terms of curriculum, we should think about it in that fashion, and I'll get to that more in a second. But what's the metaphor for alignment then? Well, we usually use a map, and especially these days on our phone, to get from place A to place B, so that if I wanted to get from the T building to the E building where we are now, I would have to follow a series of steps, and these steps mark a path within the map. They're not the map. They are just an addition to the map or a carving of the map, or to use a Deleuzian term, a tracing in the map. But they are none of the parts of the other coin. They're just a marking. So how does that apply to the current conversation? Mapping, or the general view of what happens in a program through the coordination of its courses, and then maybe you can extend that to the general education goals of the college. Well, mapping is a picture that we present, and that picture can change because some of the courses, sometimes get outdated, or we dismiss them because there is no student interest in them, or sometimes we decide to take departments in different directions, and so we add courses or we add programs, etc. So the map will look different at different iterations, and the alignment is only a tracing at a given time within the map, but a tracing that can be useful when it comes to assessment because it can signify efficiency. And here is what I mean when I say efficiency. So this is a map, if you will, of how we organize courses and we coordinate them in programs, and then we get to the general education outcomes at the college. And this is an alignment that we picked up during the last assessment cycle that's traced on the map that I showed you before. They're not exactly the same thing, right? This alignment, though, allowed us to do a thing that was rather efficient. We only assessed the course learning outcome, the CLOs. But because the alignment was efficient, we could see the result of the CLOs on the PLOs. It's the old, two birds with one stone, if you will, or perhaps with a less violent metaphor, two skips of one stone. We decided to place our stone here, and then it ended up giving us results for the program learning outcomes as well. So how did it look at the end of the process? Something like this. There were issues at the course level outcome or the course level that we'll discuss later on. There were successes at the course level that, they're great, but they're not interesting because we always try to find things that we can improve upon. But the important bit here in terms of alignment and the efficiency of alignment is that we managed to sort out what program learning outcomes we were in trouble with just by assessing the course learning outcomes. All right, so I want to beat the point too hard. But I also want to acknowledge that the process of alignment is hardly ever a straightforward process. In fact, it's one that requires hermeneutics as a term here. Hermeneutics is a term that we like in philosophy that effectively means interpretation. How can we sort out what the things in front of us mean? I will try to clarify what I mean by that with another example. So I still need to get from T to E. But there isn't only one way to get from T to E. There are many different ways. In other words, on my map, I can chart different paths or different ways of aligning my CLOs and my PLOs and possibly my GOs. And I need to decide each time what will be not only the most efficient, but the one that is going to, so to speak, assess the bits of the program or the course as it aligns on the program that I really care for. Because maybe I don't want to assess everything. I want to assess only parts. So this work also, this is the bit that requires hermeneutics on the side of assessment. This now, in other words, becomes very inefficient. And in order to make it efficient, I need to edit it down. So to give you a sense of what we did in philosophy, this is what our alignment looks like for PHL 101, which is one of two courses that we assessed. We assessed PHL 101 and PHL 102 over the last cycle. So you need to imagine that this is doubled up, if you will. I'll give you one example for sake of efficiency. So it looks like a mess. In other words, there are too many ways to get to the places I want to get. But I can trim it down and simplify it so that it becomes manageable on the one hand, because we can't always assess everything in every assessment cycle. And number two, it starts becoming intuitive how when I assess a course learning outcome, then I also get results on the program learning outcome. Now imagine, if you will, that we replicated this column here over here for our PHL 102, for our logic course. And we trimmed down the alignments as we did for PHL 101. Now we have two courses that tell us how they reflect on the program. And what we found was that the data that we got from the courses pointed to similar problems in the program. So that was a kind of validation of our method, if you will. Because we didn't get problems here, 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 here. We got problems with these last 2 program learning outcomes. And those problems were, we were alerted of those problems by both courses. So in that sense, the alignment becomes an efficient tool to just assess progressively, if you will. All right, so to give you a little bit of an example of how this worked. So this would be a course learning outcome in our Philosophy 101. The students had to be able to explain some ideas in the Western tradition. And we decided that we were going to align it most especially with a PLO. And we assumed that if the students were able to complete this, then they were also assessed for the program learning outcome. The same program learning outcome being validated, on the other hand, by the logic, the PHL 102 course assessment that reflected similar data. And then there were other cases in which we learned that our course learning outcome, as mapped on 2 in these cases, program learning outcomes, wasn't reflecting student learning at the program learning outcome level, and neither at the course learning outcome level. And the nice validation was that when we assessed during the same cycle the logic program on course level outcomes that would map onto these 2 program level outcomes, we got the same result. So we knew that indeed there was some type of issue there. We couldn't diagnose exactly what issue, but we knew that an issue there was indeed. And so here's the first conclusion I want to get to with regards to the first point. Alignment is a great thing. It brings efficiency to the assessment plan because of the correspondence of CLOs and PLOs. However, it requires a big deal of hermeneutics. There are a lot of decisions that need to be made there, and that's the work that's required for alignment. So this would be kind of the first stop in our 5-step sequence. So if there are any questions or comments, we can take them up now. I won't pressure anybody, but feel free to interact, or if I left something out or if something wasn't clear, I'm happy to consider it while I take a swig of water, and then we can move on.
How many classes do you think is sufficient for CLO assessment? And what is your cutoff? I mean, at what point do you say, yes, I'm satisfied?
That's a good question. Can I answer that question in 2 slides?
Please.
Okay. So I guess that the question is not only one, it's both one of tactic, how do you get students to participate, and also one of strategy. What type of collection of data do you want to get? So I'm going to answer the tactic first, and then I'll get to the strategy piece. Actually, no, I'll do both at the same time. So I'll narrate this slide, but also I'll get to the strategy. So what do we want to assess, or what's our strategy here? We decided that we were not interested in assessing sections because sections are already assessed. We give students, a variety of formative assessments, and traditionally a midterm and a final. So if I want to know how well a section is doing, well, I just take that data and analyze it. But what I want to do is analyze a course which comprises multiple sections and possibly a program, and therefore we get to our problem is student participation. How do we incentivize students to participate? One more word on this before we move on. So why do we want to assess courses and programs? Because data is not the divine force that we take it to be. What do I mean by that? Usually because data is expressed in numbers, we think, well, these are factual realities. But they are not factual realities. The way in which we, first and foremost, decide to collect data, or what type of data we decide to collect, is already um, uh, tainting the data with our view. And I'll say more on that later on. But that means that we need to have enough data that we are able to establish trends. So to get to my answer is, well, you need to have enough. I don't know exactly what's enough, but I can tell you how much of enough we collected and why we thought that it was enough. The big point here is we decided to disregard section level assessment. We wanted course and we wanted program because we wanted to see trajectories of where students would go in an attempt to collect enough data, number one, but number two, enough relevant data. One of the issues of data is not only size, but for education is who gives you that data. If my top 5% students do my assessment, then it looks like, my course is doing fantastic and my program is stellar. But if everybody does it, then I get a more accurate picture. And if only the bottom 5% of students perform, it looks like, my course is trash, whereas it may not be. So in order to avoid those issues, and in order to stay in the middle where we get a good sample but also a relevant sample, we wanted a lot of data to identify trends. How did we get it? We tried to put it on students' phones. It had to have the data collection, or the artifact, as we call it these days, had to be efficient as the alignment that we just talked about. So it had to be available on student cell phone, and we have a free tool that works very well in that sense, and that was Microsoft Forms, and we decided to use that one. Because we couldn't give student incentives in order to collect that data. In other words, these days, if you're a company that wants to do a satisfaction survey, you would say, okay, do this thing, I'll give you a $25 Amazon card, things of that sort. We did not want to do that because we didn't want the data to be skewed. So this had to be, the tool had to be used by students unbiasedly. The only incentive that we could offer was that this would be a quick thing. The students didn't have to waste a lot of time on it. And so our target was to make sure that students could go through this tool in 10 minutes or thereabout. And then finally, we wanted a tool that wouldn't cost us time at the end of the process when it came to collecting data, all the data from all the students and getting to the metadata. And I have to say, Microsoft Form just worked really well for us. We had 50 submissions from 6 courses. We usually offer 10 sections of, from course sections, I should say here. We usually offer 10 sections of PHL 101 and 2 sections of PHL 102 each semester. So this is about 50% return rate. The number of students is possibly less. It's around 40% because we average 20 students per section. The student completed this in a little over 10 minutes, so our target was met. And finally, when we looked at the data, we could look at it in aggregate. And so we got pie charts, and the work was all done for us. So a tool that is efficient is a good tool, and it has to be efficient for the student that we want to assess, the student population, but also for whoever analyzes that data. But remember, just like in alignment, efficiency comes at the cost of hermeneutics. So efficiency of the artifact or of the tool comes at the cost of hermeneutics. You can't just deploy anything and expect it to work. So if you bear with me, back to our metaphor for a second. So there are many ways to get from building T to building E. But the many ways are not just determined by my choice. They're also determined by the type of means of transportation that I use to get from one place to the other. So that if I want to bike, I will probably go through the quad. But if I want to drive, then I'll have to take the street. Okay. The tool or the efficiency of the tool is an analog to this. I have to decide what tool I'm going to use in order to facilitate the alignment on my map. Or in other words, the tool that I use had to work with the alignment that I established. So what did that look like in practice? Like a long spreadsheet, effectively. Let me describe what's here. So these are our course learning outcome, only some and only for philosophy 101 to make it fit into the page, but I'm happy to share data. And so, if you will, this part we already discussed, how the course learning outcome aligned with multiple program learning outcomes, but we selected only one of the two, only the first one in this case. And then here's an assessment tool that is efficient and that, by means of hermeneutics, I made sure that would align with the CLO and also would tell me something about this PLO. So in other words, this was the right vehicle to take this road onto this map. Does that make sense? And so forth for the other tools that we use, or for the other section of the tool, for the other sections of the tools, and also for PHL 102. Did we do it right is the question. Well, in some cases, yeah, looks like we did it right. We picked out the right tool and the students knew how to address, how to take, so to speak, that bus onto that track to get to the point we wanted. And in some cases, no. So this part, at least for the student, didn't work. The student's answer was, yeah, the sentence sounds good, but it has no meaning, or I have no idea what to do down here. Oops. Now, this student was not the majority. This wasn't the majority of answers we got here were these. But this tells me something. So for instance, it tells me that the hermeneutics of my assessment tool was targeted for some students, for the students in some courses, but not for in some course sections, but not for the students in other course sections. This was revealed later on. I'm anticipating something that I'll discuss later, but this was revealed later on when we tried to close the loop. Eugene and I and 6 other philosophy instructors sat around the table and discussed the results. And it turned out that in one of our colleagues' classes, well, they didn't work on Socrates' statement at the beginning of the semester, like the majority of us does. They decided to postpone it toward the end of the semester. And so when we delivered the assessment tool, well, you know, as it were, that those students didn't have a ticket to ride the bus that we planned for them. That's why you need a good representative sample of data, because we are not trying to say everybody in every class does this. What we're trying to say is what type of trends can we gather from the information that we get, or what type of trends can we sketch, I should say. So conclusion on the second part. Assessment tools should be targeted to courses, at least not to sections, but they yet require faculty's hermeneutics. They require faculty to stay there and decide how this tool is going to work on the alignment. Again, so I'll take another sip of water. But this is also another good moment for reflections or conversations.
I was wondering about the mechanics of this. how you deliver this on the cell phone? At what point in the semester? I think you answered that. Some classes are ready for the questions, some maybe not so.
Mm-hmm.
Is that within class? Do you monitor them? How do you avoid not looking up?
All the good answers. Okay, answering 3 slides. All the good questions. Okay.
So it is. So your assessment consisted of how many questions?
A different number for different for the 2 courses, but roughly speaking, 10 questions.
So 10 questions.
Mm-hmm.
And out of the 10 questions, you had to get how many right to achieve the level? I thought I saw 75%.
Well, it didn't work. We didn't conceive it that way. So let me just go back here. Each question would be aligned individually with 1 CLO. So that 1 question gave you data about that 1 CLO. We didn't care about the totality of correct answers on our tool. We only cared about the data, the proportion was 1-to-1. 1 question, 1 CLO gives us reflection to 1, sometimes 2 PLOs. That way, I don't care about, that's another way to try to front load issues like, different courses or different sections within a course go at different paces.
So was one PLO assessed in different courses?
That's correct, if you will. All the PLOs were assessed in 2 courses, and the assessment of the PLOs was a reflection of the CLOs that were assessed in the courses. So that I get the CLOs results here, the CLOs results here, and then because I aligned them, I know how they're going to tell me information about the PLOs. And whenever there's alignment matched, I had a pretty good sense that this went right, but there was some type of problem here perhaps on the level of the PLOs, because both courses told me that information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So the course outcome, the program learning outcome were tied together to make sure that program learning outcome is successful tied to that course.
Correct. And that the assessment tool that I used, for instance, this question, the word philosophy means, was a good question to make sure that I understood the data that I got with regards to this CLO, and was also a good question that would align this CLO with this specific PLO.
So it was a multiple choice question with 1 correct.
Mostly multiple choice for the most part, because it had to be quick. And then there were some open questions, but we asked students to answer in 1 or 2 sentences. And then we assessed their answers on a scale of 1 to 5 based on Bloom's taxonomy. And the scale was consistent across open questions. There is another example of open question down here. Yeah.
So to complete the program, how many courses a student has to take?
That's a very good question. So for our purposes, in theory, so the students need to have 60 credits. They need to take at least 12 of those in philosophy. However, our program is very, very, very small. We have 4 students declaring concentration in philosophy. So even on the assumption that each of these 4 students follows the pathway that we have outlined for them, we only would have 4, and we will only assess for those 4. But we wanted to assess our program level outcomes because we get vast majority of students in all kinds of concentrations and programs and certificates, because we offer humanities credits, and our credits are also diversity credits, and students need them to graduate. They often end up in our courses. So for us, it was important to address the PLOs, even though we only have 4 students, because we just offer so many courses to the larger student population. So we want to get a sense of how well it does.
But those 4 students would have to take all 12 courses, is that right?
They would have to take all 12 credits, 4 courses.
Oh, 4 courses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but you are assessing only 2.
Yes. So the
So why
assessment
not 4?
cycle, because the assessment cycle 2022-2023 required that we assess a third of our courses, and we have 6 courses in philosophy.
I'm just trying to understand.
No. That's a very valid question, and in fact, it's one that's relevant coming up. So this bit we did. Okay, here we are. All right. The next piece is collaboration. So I decided to articulate the collaboration in the phase before the deployment of the assessment tool or the artifact, and after the deployment of the assessment tool. And just moving a little bit quickly here. So yeah, at this stage, collaboration is effectively necessary because if I am the only one that performs the hermeneutics on the assessment tool, in other words, if I'm the only one that decides that these questions are good questions to align with that CLO and with that PLO, then I have a greater risk of being mistaken. So running this through my colleagues' judgment, and in some cases better judgment than mine, assured that we were using a good assessment tool. On the other hand, after the assessment tool has been deployed, we had almost an entire department meeting dedicated to explaining how we collected data, what data we collected, and what the aggregate data looked like. We had another session, and I'll show you in a sec, dedicated to the interpretation of the data. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, thanks to the grant, we decided what type of closing the loop activities we were going to do and actually implemented those. One thing that I'll come back on is that we were able to do this because there was kind of an institutional representative for assessment in our department, in this case, myself, and that was the assessment fellow, so that somebody had the responsibility for the collaboration to take place, because collaboration, unfortunately, doesn't take place without coordination. Somebody has to say, it's the time to do this, or this is the data, or what do you all think about this? Collect all the information and then present it in an organized manner. And here is just some example of how coordination yielded collaboration. So here's just an example of trying to harvesting information from other faculty with regards to the quality of the assessment tool. I gave a first draft, but then that first draft had to be edited so that it would be as accurate as possible. How did we deploy it? Well, deployment was one of the greatest tasks, if you will, of the fellow. Because not only I had to put it in a format with the Microsoft Form that would be accessible to students, but then I reviewed in the literature what were kind of the best practices for deployment. And turns out that one of the best practices is ask your colleagues to take 10 minutes out of their time in class for students to take the assessment, letting students know that this has no bearing on their final grade. And this required repeated requests just by the nature of the institution that has a variety of part-time faculty that don't have time or don't all consistently check their emails and so forth. Another aspect was data collection and explanation. So at some point, we held a presentation of the data at the department meeting, but then specifically philosophy had to come together to decide, what are we going to do with this? What type of ideas can we generate to address the issues that we have, and then eventually close the loop? And another one was effectively the closing the loop activity. So the assessment fellow was tasked, among other things, with devising ways that would be sustainable to close the loop and address the issues that the assessment had highlighted. So that meant writing a grant, getting some money, because we thought in the department, the full-timers thought that without a small stipend, we couldn't convince the part-time faculty to sit on a 3-hour professional development workshop, which is what we all thought we needed to address the problems we found in our program. So this is all, hours of work and compiling of data and sending of emails that requires time, and then of course directing that closing the loop activity. So there's another giant presentation about that, but I'll give you just a couple of samples of what we thought were the issues and how we could address them. So these 2 PLOs were identified as areas of concern for us, and the 2 PLOs effectively boil down to, can our students understand philosophical reasoning and then use it to express their own philosophical viewpoints or their own opinions about facts of the world. And we had the idea, well, if the students aren't able to do these things, it's because probably they don't do enough formative work. They don't spend enough time in the classroom doing the job of reflecting on their own thinking, explaining their own thinking. And so if there were changes, these changes had to be had at the level of the syllabus. The syllabus had to integrate those moments, and then at the level of the lesson plan. So here are a variety of ways. 2 things that we talked a lot about were grade distribution. Are our faculty giving too much weight to summative assessment forms, midterms, finals, and then they don't give enough weight to all those activities that the students can do in class to refine their thinking? And number 2, extra credit policy. Can we incentivize the students to go to conferences, go to the talks that we organize, because those are the places where you put your knowledge at work, as it were. And then we try to target those at the level of the lesson plans. So these are some things that we already do in philosophy, but we try to, especially for faculty that were new to the department, exchange ideas on how possibly make sure that these activities were integrated with their lecture, their presentations, and so forth. So conclusion number 3, collaboration and coordination are essential at the pre and post moments with regards to the deployment of the assessment tool. Now, I'm going to quickly go through our 2 issues. Unless there are pressing issues, I want to be respectful of your time. Good to go? Okay. So, first challenge. Everybody gets this challenge whenever they try to collect data, and it's fuzzy data. I like to call it fuzzy. It just gives me the idea of something that's hardly defined, and I think it demystifies the idea that these are numbers and they must be true. Perhaps the most important bit to keep in mind is that there are what I term external and internal reasons as to why data collection can be tricky. So some of the external reasons. Are your students sick as they are taking your assessment tool? Are they distracted? Are they sleepy at night when they take it, and so forth? Are they having issues with technology? That was one of our issues. For instance, in one of the questions on the assessment tool for PHL 1 or 2 was simply cut off. We didn't know why. When we planned it, when we input the information on the form was there, when it was deployed to the student, the question was cut off. So there is a mess, and we couldn't assess that CLO. But other issues with technology could be, student's phone runs out of battery in the middle of it, they can't log back on. But there's also some internal issues. The thing that I mentioned before, I assumed that everybody would discuss Socrates at the top of the semester, and so I asked that question, whereas one of our colleagues decided to discuss it later. Or these issues are generally tied to the hermeneutical process that I mentioned above. So the more collaboration, the better hermeneutics, the fewer internal issues you're going to get. In that sense, then the greater the data sample, the better, most relevant data you're going to get. And this is an example of the issue that we are running into with this semester's assessment. So last cycle, we assessed a third of the courses. We're down 50% there. Last cycle, because of the alignment, we had lesser PLOs. And this cycle, we're not assessing them. Last cycle, we assessed 50 students, individual students. This cycle, we have 8. And last cycle, we assessed roughly 50% of courses in 50% of sections in 2 courses. This cycle is about 33% of sections in 1 course. And this is an issue because the data that I'm going to get here, and I'm going to show you what results that we got, is much fuzzier than this data. This data allows me to establish trends much more clearly than that. Another thing that I think could be rethought at the institutional level, this is not my place to establish it, it's something that will have to be done in assessment committee, but I think that there is a possibility to make our assessment of GEOs more efficient here. If the alignment works for CLOs and PLOs, so that when I assess CLOs with a good assessment tool, I get information about PLOs, why can't it work all the way up to GEOs? This would also give us a better sense of how individual disciplines achieve GEOs. The way we do it now has its merit. For instance, it's randomized. But we also, because it's a separate process, end up collecting little data. We have, 11,800 students. We assessed GEOs for 300. That's 2.5% about. It's not a lot of information. It doesn't show us trends. It's enough, don't get me wrong, it's enough, and I understand the institutional implications here, it's enough so that when our creditors come, we can say, yes, we do this. And there is some good spirit of research in it with randomized samples and so forth. But if we're thinking about our own internal goals to really see whether students achieve GEOs or not, it's a little on the skinny side of data for my taste. Other challenges of assessment, this is my very last point. Assessment needs to go far and needs to be wide. And what I mean for this is that we need to have a longitudinal view of assessment. Assessment is unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, tied to the nature of teaching. And so it's a cyclical open system. And it doesn't allow you to ever stop. And it's comparable to things like tending your garden or going to the gym. You don't do it once, you do it repeatedly, and you try to learn from what happened the previous session or last season in order to improve this time around. But you're always facing, because it's open, new conditions, new students, new student trends, new enrollment trends, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we need a longitudinal view. The second bit is, once again, the width, the data sample. So why does it need to be longitudinal? Well, for many of the reasons that I said before, because alignment needs to be replicated across years, because we need to keep on collaborating with faculty through the phases of assessment, but most especially because we need to get a sense whether our closing the loop activities worked or didn't work. And so we need to be able to transfer knowledge from T1 or assessment cycle 1 to T2 and assessment cycle 2, or as the farmer would say, you know, what happened last year and what's happening this year. Another reason why it needs to be longitudinal is that we need to understand what type of changes are happening. Are we able to replicate our data? Or are we able to get the same data assessing a different third of our CLOs? Because that will confirm quite a bit of information about the PLOs. So examples about what happened to us. So these were kind of the red flags in the assessment cycle that I led a year ago. And these are kind of the data that correspond to it with regards to the highlights of what happened a year ago. We don't know whether these things had an effect or not, because the assessment approach faulted in how far we went. We basically closed it in a year. So maybe the closing the loop activities worked, but we didn't assess it, so we don't really have data to sort that out. Maybe the program had an improvement, but we didn't assess for program, so oh well, etc. Assessment in terms of width. I think we said enough about fuzzy data. What I really want to focus on is the closing the loop activities. And so I'll give you an example for what happened to us. Look at this. That CLO was not met in 22-23, but was met in 23-24. That's great news. That's exactly what you want your data to show. But are we sure that this data is wide enough to tell us that this is relevant information? Because we had only 8 students answer this question. Were they the top 8 students? I don't know.
50 in the other one? Yeah. You got 50 in the other?
Yeah, I got 50 in this one. Yeah. Were these activities bearing on this? I don't know, because we didn't assess them. So we possibly got some good result, but because the width of our spectrum was so narrow, we didn't. Okay, finally, why do I think that we ran into that problem? Well, at least for our discipline, and I'm only speaking about our discipline, that we moved the institutional format of assessment. We went from an assessment fellow to effectively individual faculty doing assessment. And there are some, I think, inherent issues here. I identified 2. The assessment fellow has an institutional role. In my signature, said full-time faculty in philosophy assessment fellow. I presented at OpenStax. I was introduced as, hey, this is the assessment fellow at Triton and so on. And they felt, honestly, the weight of the institutional responsibility. Somebody had to take care of this. I was the person to take care of it. The year prior was Eugene, and so forth and so on. Whereas the system we have now allows for individual faculty to assess their own courses only. And so it subjects us to what Harding would call a tragedy of the commons. In other words, whose table is this? I don't know. Anybody who wants to use it. Okay, then it's not mine. I don't have to take care of it. and Eugene doesn't have to take care of it. And somebody might come around that wants to take care of it, but doesn't have the same embedded responsibility as this. Bit number one. Bit number two. The assessment fellow, when we signed our contract and got our stipends and our blue forms and so forth and so on, we were explicitly tasked with inter and intra assessment cycle. We had to carry out that cycle from beginning to end, and then we had also to show how we were going to step onto the next cycle. That was a job. In the description that we have these days for what we term assessment leads, but they're not really leads because they may choose to not submit common artifacts. But if they don't submit common artifacts, then we're never gonna get the data that we need to establish information across courses. We only gonna get data tied to the course section. But data from the course section we already have. It's in the midterms and the finals and so forth. And most especially, they may not move on to the next assessment cycle. So the intra assessment bit, we also lose. All right, I'll close it here. I think there were some successes. I think there are some challenges. These are not unique to Triton, I have to say, as the more I read about these things, the more these two issues seem to be common, data and institutional architecture for assessment. So I think that there is a chance here to do something good. And hopefully we have identified some strategies, at least for a discipline, that will allow us to do so. It's 1:59. Thank you for bearing with me till the very last minute. And if you need more information,